So we're here at Jacob's Well in central Texas, and this is a tunnel system entrance, and the tunnel has no known end.
People climb Everest, they establish a base camp, they move equipment from Camp 1 to Camp 2, Camp 2 to Camp 3. We do exactly the same thing underwater. The highlight of most cavers and cave divers is to be the first person in a system. I mean, you are the first human being to ever see these features, and there's a real thrill to that. We have been to, we call it EOL, which stands for end of line. That's 4,341 feet from the surface.
There's branching tunnels, and they just keep going and going, and then they mapped it. They mapped the amount they've been able to access. It's just this little creek here, and then suddenly there's this well that goes straight down. And it's also, by the way, an exit for water from beneath the earth. So the water's coming up, coming up, coming up, so it's an artesian spring, they call it. Water from the tunnel system that leads to the inner earth. And right next to the well, of course, is the standard terraforming of the ancients. Now, the ancients put their hardest layers on top, so we have this incredible, in this case, we have an incredibly thick, really hard layer, and then below it, softer layer. I'll just get real close on that to show you what's happening. Softer, chalky, earthquake mitigating layer, okay? And that's been eroded, and a really, really soft layer directly beneath it, right? Just a really short, soft layer, okay? Then a softer layer that's been eroded, you can see, over time. And then a slightly harder layer that has had less erosion because it's harder, okay? Softer layer, a little bit of erosion, right? Harder layer, not quite as much erosion. Softer layer, chalky. And then it steps down to this other very hard concrete-like material. You can see these massive blocks. This is all ancient concrete, ancient concrete. And we have the usual vertical seam. And you say, well, that's just the edge of a rock. Oh, is it? Well, let's check it out. Let's just see what we're looking at here, okay? Because the geologists didn't come here. If they came here, they just walked past it, okay? This is a vertical seam in ancient concrete. And you're like, but that's just two rocks that are next to each other. I understand. This is what we've been told. Now, this is an eon, right? If this is sedimentary rock, sedimentary layer, laid down naturally, then that's an eon. And the next layer is another eon, next layer is another eon, next layer is another eon. Here's a seam in that first layer. Looks like a fracture, but it's actually a seam between two sections. On the left is a smaller section, on the right, a larger section, okay? Now this seam comes down. Down, down, down. And the ancient eons of material, as the institutional geologists would say, somehow have a seam running through all of them that goes all the way along here. Wait, what? So this seam is the same seam, and it just keeps going. I'm not going to back into the well there, but it just keeps going. Okay? So we've got this seam, and I'm just going to get photos as we go. Okay. There it is. So this seam goes through, not a fracture, but a seam. Fractures break apart, seams join together. This seam goes through layer after layer after layer, and up here it has come apart a little bit on the top layer. That was previously a seam and not a fracture. It's a fractured seam, let's call it. So then we have to ask ourselves, if the institutional geologists are not doing their job and looking at the material, who will look at it? And what are the institutional geologists doing to earn their salaries? I just want to give you a reverse angle on this seam to show you that the seam goes through all of the material. So the entire vertical height of this hill was built in sections left to right. So here's the seam, right? There it is. There it is, you see it? See it? Got another seam going off to the left there, but for right now we'll just follow this one. Single seam, an ancient concrete. We're just going to follow it. Now here, it looks like it breaks into two seams. One that's here, one that's here. So there's two next to each other. See those lines? One there, one there. And we're going to follow the right-hand one. So that's interesting, right? Now there's something else I just noticed. I'm just going to finish this little movie there that took you along the seam, but I wanted to show you something I just noticed as we're looking here. It looks like the ancients were using seashells in their terraforming, and that's an incredibly interesting thing. 3D printing has gotten to the point where they're using seashell material, calcium carbonate. So the seashells are calcium carbonate, and then you go, wait, if we're using seashells, maybe the ancients used seashells. So seashells are not proof that this is sedimentary material. Geologists will say, well, if there's a seashell in it, obviously it's natural. No.
After leaving the pyramid complex in Bosnia, where I spent 23 months, I had begun to think about terraforming, because when I went to Serbia and then Croatia after being in Bosnia, I went on some archaeological expeditions, made some videos in it, and it became clear that what I was finding was not clearly natural. In other words, it wasn't obviously natural. To me, it was built. I can't prove that, but there is evidence that it was built, and some of the evidence was straight line seams that were vertical through what the Orthodox scientific community would call sedimentary layers. So, you know, there was a hill that had been cut out for quarrying in Serbia, for instance, right next to a mountain called Kosmaj, but directly to the east of that was this hill. Half of it had been taken away, so you could see the structure of the hill. And you saw this tortured material as if natural forces had sort of moved it around, and so it looked natural, except then you saw the straight line seams that went upward through many different layers, what the orthodoxy would call eras, and that's impossible. So nature would never make a straight line seam through many different eras, the same line through many different eras of sedimentary material.
Let's say that you were building a hill and you were layering it layer by layer, and then you stopped and went to get some more material, and then this is where you stopped, right here on the right. That was done first, perhaps. That very straight line, right? And then the stuff on the left was put on afterwards. Possibility.
We are the first one who actually analyzed those stone balls.
Nous sommes à l'heure actuelle en fait les premiers qui ont analysé ces sphères de pierre.
We took samples from 4 traces of the stone balls and one from the natural stone material. We did chemical and physical analysis. This is what we found out.
Et ce qu'on a trouvé,
9 elements
9 éléments,
are exactly the same
sont exactement les mêmes.
in the case of the stone balls and natural stone. And then one element only the natural stone has, SeO2. The stone balls don't have it.
Et les sphères de pierre ne l'ont pas. Donc, il y a
They
dans les-
have 2 elements instead. One is manganum. Manganum we use today to give the hardness to the material. And the second one is calcium carbonate, a binder. So our conclusion, the builders of the stone balls were using natural stone, then melted, adding the additives to get extreme hardness, and then pouring into the molds to get this spherical shape. And when they got dry, they got very hard and solid.
I'm just going to come back out a little bit. You can see the top being so regular. The line is really regular, even though the composition of the hill is of this really strong tortured material, seemingly tortured if it was natural, and yet the top is perfectly smooth. It doesn't make any sense. If this stuff came into existence by the forces of nature, the hill would not be so smooth at the top.
And then you come to Texas and you find the same domes happening too, that are perfect domes. But anyway, so I was in Croatia and I was thinking about terraforming. I was like, why does it seem like everywhere I go in the Balkans area, it looks like the entire landscape is terraformed? And I made many videos on that. And then I found a seashell in a block that had been quarried from the stuff that I had thought was terraformed. And I thought, that kind of busts my theory. There's not going to be a seashell, a natural seashell in terraformed material, right? Well, then I was looking at 3dprint.com's newsletter, and there was an article about seashells, and it said that today we scientists, engineers, use seashells, the material of seashells. I wonder if the ancients just took the seashells that were around and used that in their terraforming. In other words, they weren't building the earth, but the people who were terraforming the earth after it was built used material that was here from the living organisms. So in other words, the seashell seemed to bust the theory, but then it can be incorporated. It still doesn't mean that terraforming is the fact. It just means that it's not evidence against terraforming, you know? So I was kind of excited about that.
Jock, the next few days we have to talk long, because what you were talking just before, this is what I have here, and we are thousands of kilometers far from Visoko. I have material, a lot of clay. I have material which is concrete, but so hard. It's incredible hard, harder than our cement we are using in our days. We are now about close to 220 feet down, and we have that hard material. And we found on the way down several shells, a lot of shell and shell powder, crushed shell, to make it hard.
Well, that was a bomb dropper on this show.
See the smoothness of this face, of the seam? That's the left side of this section here. They stopped there. There's their smooth ending to their section. And there's their smooth beginnings to their other sections. Actually, there's a little bit in here too. See, because what happened is they have two seams, one and then two, right? So it's a V, two seams that go up. Interesting. So they had space there, huh? For smaller bit of concrete. Cool. Well, you see this. See, if it's a fracture, it's not going to do that. It's not going to have a flat face. Not going to have a smooth flat face. So we know it's a seam, and we also know it's a seam because it goes through all this material, and it's one line, always the same. Now this seam joins it and then goes off to the right. So they weren't precious about the right angles, right? They didn't need a right angle seam. Here's another one that goes off to the right, right? But interestingly, this seam mimics the angle of this seam. So they got a sort of a similar seamage there. Good fun. Clearly not a fracture. Fractures break apart, seams join together. So we know that's not a fracture. I mean, you'd have to be insane to say that that's fracturing. But that's what the geologists say. They want you to believe that, and they want you to pay them. Institutional geologists degreed professors. I want you to pay them to tell you that those are fractures in sedimentary material. They want you to pay them to tell you that. Let's continue on the search for the truth about our past here at Jacob's Well near Wimberley in central Texas. So we're walking back from Jacob's Well, and I just thought I'd look for a vertical seam in this material just to see if we had one going through the quote eons of material, and we found one. So I'm going to show you two things. One is that this seam continues on. It's hard to see right here, but we'll pick it up right here. Okay? So that seam goes all the way down, vertical seam, all the way down through what the universities call sedimentary material. So that makes no sense, right? And it's not a fracture, right? That is not a fracture. That's a seam. Fractures break apart, seams join together. That's clearly joined together. It's not broken apart at all. Does this look broken apart to you? Does that look broken apart? It's not a fracture. To call it a fracture would be to literally admit that you're anti-science. Either you can see or you can't, you know? You have to open your eyes and look. So that's the one thing I was going to show you, which is that that's a seam that runs through many layers of built material. But look again at the edge, or let's say the face of the right-hand section on this top section here. Look at that face. See how flat that is? Now watch. This is what we find all across the world. These seams, if they don't join perfectly flush, you can see one side or the other, and you can see how flat it is. If it's fracturing, it would be this chaotic, non-smooth surface, right?